Hello, everybody, and welcome to our next to the last session with Heartset Training Institute, Vicarious Trauma, Emphasizing Trust and Connection. I will be dropping out of the training a little early today, but Ryan and Khalil know how to end things. So I hope you'll hang in there till the very end, even though I won't be here. So I won't take up any more of their time, and we'll turn it over to them.
Great. Thanks, Laura. Hey, folks. It's great to be back with you. I'm getting a little teary-eyed now, a little sad. We're going to be wrapping up our time with you soon. We still have two final sessions, and I think these last two sessions are just a great way to kind of wrap up this long series. If you've been with us since January, um, again, we're talking about vicarious trauma, and maybe there have been topics that we've talked about in this training series that haven't been as impactful or relevant to your direct work, and yet I think this one is just relevant to all of us in this helping role. So we're excited to continue it. We spent a lot of time talking just like about definitions. What is vicarious trauma last time? And so we're excited to kind of dig in a little deeper and understand how it really affects us as helpers. And finally, we'll wrap up next session with ways that we can really work over the long term to manage that vicarious trauma. So that's really exciting. It is tough that we have to deal with this, but both Khalil and I really appreciate the chance to talk about it and to engage with you. So we'll just remind folks that we're excited to be in dialogue with you. So if you have something to say, please say it. We'll just kind of sit here and wait for you to kind of chat things out at us because it's your lives, it's your helping profession, it's your kind of role that you're trying to improve through managing your vicarious trauma. So we want you to get the most out of it that you can. All righty, let me move us along here. As usual, our kind of shared expectations or the things that we think will make this session go most smoothly. Um, we're going to engage you in dialogue, as I said. We want to hear from you. We're going to ask some questions. We're going to expect a little bit of participation. And in particular, we're going to close out this session with kind of a whiteboard activity as a chance to kind of share space with one another around vicarious trauma. So if you're sticking around to the end, which we hope you do, we're just inviting you to be active, watch the chat for some links and some ways to participate. You may not agree with everything we say, and we still want to hear from you. We want you to push back or think critically about the things that we're saying. We've put a lot of thought into this content and into this work, but we probably haven't thought of everything. And so we want to hear kind of dissenting opinions or critical analysis too. We do have a tight hour and a half, so we may move along our discussions, especially as they ramp up or get exciting and people have things that they want to say. We may need to move us along just to make sure we get through all the content. But so I just kind of want to give a warning about that. Then finally, you can expect as we go through this series to receive copies of the materials, copies of the slides. Sometimes we have little supplemental sheets that go along. Those are bulletin board content that you can keep with you and engage your thinking as you do the work. So we'll drop a link to a session evaluation at the end. And if you complete that, you'll get a copy of a certificate of attendance as well. All right, those are our expectations. Here are our learning objectives. 3 learning objectives as usual. So by the end of the session, we want you to be able to explain the 3 elements of disconnection that can change a helper's worldview. We'll say more about that, but vicarious trauma really affects our worldview, and it affects it through these disruptions in three critical ways. So we want you to be able to explain that or think about it. We also want you to be able to identify specific signs and symptoms of vicarious trauma. And we'll distinguish again in our review between vicarious trauma and secondary trauma. So we spent a little time at the end of the last session making those concepts distinct. And so here we're just focused on vicarious trauma. And then finally, we'll ask you to we'll hope that you'll be able to list at least 2 ways that our vicarious trauma negatively impacts our clients. So it's one thing to take care of ourselves and to do that because we're the only self that we have, right? But our vicarious trauma ends up having a really negative and sometimes harmful effect on our clients. And so we have this ethical obligation to manage that so that we're not doing harm to our clients. So here's how we're going to get there. Here's what it's going to look like today. We are going to review some concepts that we talked about last time from vicarious trauma. We'll also explore in greater depth some of those disruptions, as I mentioned, that occur in our lives as a result of vicarious trauma. We'll ask you to do a little self-assessment about some of the specific ways that vicarious trauma may be disrupting your life and your daily activities, right? Maybe there are small ways, maybe there are larger ways. It probably depends on how intensive your work is, how long you've been doing the work. But I bet everybody's got a little something that's cropping up, and that doesn't make you abnormal, and I don't mean to pathologize that, right? Like there's nothing wrong with you. That's sort of the way this work is. But we want you to be able to self-assess it. We also want you to be able to outline maybe some of the ways that the effects of vicarious trauma are going to negatively impact our client work, as I mentioned. And so we have a couple of ideas about how that shows up at the personal level and also at the agency level. And then, the subheader of this training series is emphasizing trust and connection. And so we think trust and connection are kind of key mitigating pathways towards working our way out of vicarious trauma. And so we have a bit of an exploratory activity where we'll share space with one another as a way of modeling what it looks like to build connection among our colleagues and hope that that can play a role in your managing of vicarious trauma. Finally, we'll wrap up with some key takeaways. If any folks have questions at that time, we'll take those and we'll give you some next steps. All right, so here's our review. Just to kind of go through some of those concepts we talked about last time, especially if folks weren't here last time. We talked quite a bit about empathy last session, and empathy has pros and cons, right? On the one hand, you will not be an effective helper in a supportive housing context or in many other contexts of social work if you don't engage your empathy. And what we mean by empathy is that ability to understand and even feel what somebody else is feeling, right? If a person across from you feels sad, your ability to tap into those mirror neurons and your own sense of sadness as you experience that moment with the person, that is really, that's what empathy is. And that I think is really necessary to do the kind of work that we need to do, the kind of healing work that we do. It is possible to do the work without engaging your empathy, but I bet you're not doing it that well if so, right? And I know that's probably not a hot take. Unfortunately, if we're doing that good work and if we're engaging our empathy, vicarious trauma will be an occupational hazard. It will come up. It's not something that is it skipped me, right? Like, I never experienced that. I bet you have in some way. Or maybe you're like quite well balanced and you're doing some intentional management of it. But without that management of it, you will experience the occupational hazard of empathic work on a long enough timeline. We talked last time about the way that vicarious trauma is actually quite a bit different than another term that gets used all the time, which is secondary trauma. And so here I'll remind you that secondary trauma is really that kind of acute effect, something specific that your client told you about, a trauma that they experienced. You're sitting there with them talking about it, or you're helping them navigate through that situation, and you begin to experience kind of acute PTSD-like symptoms. That's secondary trauma. It's very immediate, or it can be very immediate, and it's acute. Whereas vicarious trauma is built up over time, right? It happens not as a result of any one specific incident, but it happens as a result of dealing with the many folks on your caseload over a long period of time who are experiencing kind of the daily trials and tribulations and the major traumas that they experience, along with your own trauma as a person living in this world, right? So that major impact that it can have on our lives across aspects of our lives it builds up over time. It's more long-term. As we turn again to kind of that definition of vicarious trauma, one of the kind of key aspects of the definition of vicarious trauma is that it transforms our inner experience. And that's another way of saying that it alters our worldview, like how we see the world and how we experience the world. Common examples of this are, for example, people that support survivors of interpersonal violence may come to be quite hyper aware of that potential for violence all around them, right? They're hyper vigilant to violence because the folks that they deal with on a daily basis have experienced so much interpersonal violence, right? And so a person may begin to feel that the world is not a safe place, actually, even more so than we would think so normally, right? Another example could be that a helper may come to feel that that same survivor of interpersonal violence, they must be doing something that brings that violence onto them, right? Kind of this victim blaming may be possible. And that would represent a shift in your worldview, right? Maybe you didn't think that when you got into this work, but the longer you do it, well, they're bringing it onto themselves, right? And that's obviously not true, but it demonstrates the way that our inner experience and our understanding of the world can change as a result of vicarious trauma. And so vicarious trauma has these kind of three major disruptions. It disrupts our sense of self and our connection to ourselves. It disrupts our connection to others and our social environment. It leads to more isolation and an inability to connect and an inability to kind of exercise our empathy because of that disconnection. And then finally, it disrupts our sense of life's ultimate meaning. And that's quite existential, and that's quite significant and severe in that case, right? When that's happening. But I guess I'll say that I think this is quite sad because folks that are doing helping work are so needed, right? And so when their sense of meaning is disrupted, they're not going to be able to show up and support folks in the way that is necessary and in the way that got them into the field in the first place. Okay, so that's our quick review of some of the concepts that we talked about last time. And I'm going to kick it over to Khalil to kind of talk about, to do a deeper dive into some of these disruptions.
Thanks, Ryan. So, during our last session, we did do a lot of definition stuff, like Ryan shared. We talked a lot about what is vicarious trauma, maybe what makes it different than secondary trauma. And we're gonna do a little bit about that now, but also maybe offer some like what can we be doing about having this experience, especially if it's unavoidable, right? If like engaging in like really intense and frequent like empathy is part of our work role and makes us really good at what we do, what can we be doing to make sure that we are healthy and able to continue providing the care that we want to be providing? So the next slide covers, and I think is also a little bit of a review of what that shift in worldview or a change in worldview might look like. So just like reiterating again that vicarious trauma in particular attacks hope, right? If you ever feel like, well, my clients or the folks that I work with, my participants or this specific kind of person just doesn't get better, that is not a very healthy place to be operating from, right? And if I'm going to engage with somebody who I already think doesn't have the ability to engage or move toward health and wellness, then I'm not providing the best support that I can to this person. You might recognize this in some of your colleagues and your peers who are really cynical sometimes, right? Maybe they're never positive or hopeful about participant outcomes or what a client or participant's life can be. Increased appreciation of what we have is probably the most positive thing that we see on this slide in particular. But sometimes we do become more appreciative when we are exposed to the things that we are in our workplaces. Sometimes this is intentional and we do this mindfully on purpose. and other times it just kind of happens. But being able to, I think, to do this in a way that feels healthy and on purpose is, I think, where we want to be. If we're going to combat that change in our worldview, if you're going to challenge the change in worldview you might be experiencing because of what you experience in the work that you do. Loss of belief in the capacity to change sounds a lot like that loss of hope, right? We need to believe in a client's ability to change and grow and move toward health and wellness. Yeah, anything to add here, Ryan?
Yeah, just one other like negative, like a downside to the positive stuff that you were talking about there, where, vicarious trauma may cause us to sort of feel um, appreciative of what we have and thankful for it, and maybe we work harder on people's behalves because of it. We want them to have what we have, but it can also cause us to kind of it can transform our belief into this sense that, well, I worked for what I have and I deserve what I have, and if somebody doesn't have what I have, it must mean that they're not doing enough. They're not working hard enough. They don't deserve it. Right. And so that shift in worldview that like people, that like a person doesn't deserve housing unless they work for it in very specific ways, I think can run counter to our empathic approach. Right. So there is positives there, but also negatives in terms of how that can show up, I think.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for adding that. And if you didn't say this, Ryan, because I might have missed this part too, but the same can be said if your appreciation for what you have decreases, right? If you start to feel shameful of the things that you have because of the things that your participants are experiencing in their day-to-day. I think that is also a changing moment. Like, wow, I don't deserve this thing, right? That deservability piece, I think, can really kind of function both ways. I don't deserve this, or the clients I'm working with don't deserve this because they didn't work for it in the way that I did.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the key there is that like that sense of deserve that brings about that shame or that like antagonism, that shame, that antagonism, that stuff doesn't like we can't sit well with that for very long before like we're doing pretty bad work or we start to do things that maybe we would consider harmful to our clients, right? Like not meeting them where they are, not providing the resources that they need. Not taking care of ourselves because we don't think we deserve what we have, right? So it has all of these negative avalanching effects for us.
Mhm. Awesome. And I think one of the other, I think, big takeaways from just conversations and discussion around vicarious trauma, or the trauma space in general, is that vicarious trauma symptoms can mirror and look a lot like traditional trauma symptoms that can mirror some things you might see in the DSM, right? How we might diagnose something like PTSD, um, or an acute stress disorder, right? These are specific trauma diagnoses. And vicarious trauma can come with some similar symptoms. Um, and one of those symptoms is fragmentation, right? The fracturing of, Ryan, am I frozen? Okay. Your face was very still, so I wasn't sure if I was frozen, but you're just,
I
yeah.
think you're good.
Fragmentation is a very common symptom of trauma, right? Parts of ourselves manifesting or becoming more present because of needing to protect ourselves or be more present during a time when maybe our lives were in danger, or even if they weren't actually in danger, maybe we were just fearful for our lives. And that initial fragmentation or existing in a way that is fragmented is a trauma symptom, period. I'd like to say, like generally. So that exists in the vicarious trauma space as well. Different parts of our lives can feel disconnected from one another, right? Your work self might be completely different than who you are in your personal life, right? And there are some pros to that. You probably should not be a therapist in every space you take up, right? Or not be a case manager or not be a social worker when you are just like hanging with your friends and having a good time. Um, but maybe we're doing that more. Maybe that's making it more into our personal lives, and maybe that is protecting something in us. That idea of like, I need to fix, or here are people I can fix if I can't fix the folks that I work with or work for or alongside. And also we might just completely shut down after engaging in our work, right? If you have a really intense and stressful day, I am friends with quite a few therapists who, at the end of the day, they don't want to talk anymore because they've talked all day, right? So that idea of just like, I'm feeling really disconnected, don't have the energy or capacity to engage, can also represent that fracturing or fragmentation, that disconnectedness. Um, Another word for this is dissociation. I think this is a word that we use a lot, also very common in the trauma space. Um, and we or people or your participants might dissociate to also protect themselves. I think I said that at the top of the slide, right? From something that's going on. And it's not something that happens intentionally always. Sometimes we don't even know we're doing it. Um, I'll give like a silly like surface level example, but if you've ever gotten to your destination, maybe you've gotten home after work, or maybe you've gotten to the parking lot before work, and you've just sat in your car and stared into space or stared at your phone. These might be some subtle signs of dissociating, right? I'm disconnected, I'm here, maybe I can't move, maybe I feel a little bit of like numbness or just the inability to move or to do or to execute can also be a sign of dissociation. I think doom scrolling is probably a really pop culture example of what that could look like for folks as well. Oh, here we go, right in the chat. I do think doom scrolling is a small example of dissociation. Yep. Um, and I don't think we have to pathologize this fully all the time and like, oh my gosh, I'm dissociating, so I must have this diagnosis that's in the DSM, right? Again, like symptoms don't always mean like a diagnosis, but there is literature about this. It is written somewhere and could mean something, but also doesn't have to. I think dissociation is also just a way that we cope, right? That's what we see here on the slide. To make my life easier, I maybe need to be a little disconnected right now. And I think one approach to maybe challenging this gently or combating this is um, when I think about mindfulness and meditation, I like to think about the idea of like dissociating on purpose. I am in control of this, right? I am controlling like or trying to or attempting to control where my thoughts go, or paying attention to the thoughts that are here, or the thoughts that I'm trying to push away that are coming up for me that I don't want to be experiencing right now. Mindfulness and meditation is a skill, and I think that it is challenging for a lot of folks, but I think it can be taught and learned over time. I offer that as just something to look into on our own time. I think we may even talk about that a little bit further into the training, but yeah, anything to add about dissociation or like the fractured self, Ryan?
Yeah, I think that dissociation does sound like a scary word. And I think we associate it with like dissociative identity disorder, which most people will call multiple personality disorder. And I think when we kind of pull back from that very, very extreme sense of dissociation, I think you were saying this, but I'm just sort of reiterating that like dissociation, I think, occurs for many of us a lot of time, like a lot. It again, just staring off into space is a sort of a lower end of the spectrum version of dissociation. And so I guess I just to reiterate something that you said also, like that you don't need to be scared by that because it's sort of a coping response to what we're
Mhm.
experiencing, this fracturing of the self. Um, and I wanted to say, like, with respect to the mindfulness piece, the reason I think mindfulness and like meditation is so effective for this is because what it's really doing there is like you're paying attention to your body. Like, what does my body feel like? What's happening in my thoughts? And so it's almost like building connection where when we're not in that mindful space, we're sort of just like loose and fragmented, right? It's like, okay, I'm here now. I can feel the pillow under my butt. I can feel the temperature of the room. Oh, I've been thinking about work for the last 3 minutes. Let me bring my thoughts back to this moment, right? Like that increased sense of connection, I think is really what that is all about, for me at least.
Yeah. I practice a specific trauma intervention called prolonged exposure therapy, where folks are intentionally making contact with stories of like trauma that they've had in their life. So they are telling and retelling the single isolated incident stuff, right? So maybe that is like sexual assault or like gun violence or like witnessing something really scary. And one of the things that I've noticed in clients who like engage in prolonged exposure therapy is um, sometimes when we're doing some processing after like the storytelling piece, they might say something like, I don't know why I didn't do X, Y, and Z, right? And they might talk about what they were feeling in that moment, and it might actually be nothing, or it might have been like really intense fear kind of guiding the way and leading them during that really scary interaction. I think sexual assault is like a challenging example to talk about and a hard one. It's like messy and really gross feeling, but I think is a good example and one we probably are many of us are familiar with. That idea of like if you've ever been sexually assaulted in your life, or if you know anybody who has and has said, you know, I just had to go numb, or like maybe they have to, but like that's what my brain and my body did, right, to protect myself. I wasn't there, I wasn't present, I couldn't say no. I think those are other kind of really understandable examples of what it looks like to dissociate. Um, and we do think or know there is a lot of literature around like dissociating being like an adaptive kind of response. You learn to do this over time, but then also some things we just can't prepare for, and we don't know that our bodies and our brains are going to do that. Sexual assault, for example, or like really any sort of like violence against like your body. We don't necessarily know that that's how we respond until that does happen.
Which I think is a good parallel to like the experience of vicarious trauma, because those traumas that you're talking about are more like first person trauma. And the same is true with vicarious trauma in the sense that like we don't necessarily know that's going to happen. Like this, the effects of our secondary trauma have been building for some time. And before I realize it, every time I go home, I'm dissociated, right? Or every time I'm at work, I'm dissociated, and I go home and things feel right, like those differences between our different spaces in our lives. So just that parallel is there as well.
Yeah. Just one more thing, and then I'm done, I swear. If you've ever driven somewhere and been like, oh my gosh, I'm here, and don't remember your drive, I think that's another example of like what dissociation can be like that we all might experience or have experienced in our lives. Even if you take public transit, right? Oh, I'm here. What was I doing this whole ride? I think is another easy example to understand what that could look like.
Yeah. So there, we kind of have spent this slide talking about the disconnection from ourselves and others, right? Because dissociation can affect our connection with others. But the other kind of big component of vicarious trauma is that it affects our sense of meaning. And so we haven't kind of engaged with you all in the chat too much so far. So let me just kind of bring this question to the chat. I want to know to what extent you feel the things that you do in your life are worthwhile, right? So think about work, for example, the work that you do and what brings you to this training. I would love for folks in the chat to just write a number on a 1 to 10 scale of to what extent you feel like your work is worthwhile or meaningful. So a 10 would be like it is the most meaningful thing in my life, and a 1 would be it is the least meaningful thing in my life. Would love to hear people kind of respond to that. How meaningful is your work in your life right now? Alan puts a 9. That's quite high, Alan. You must be quite committed. Yeah, lot of high numbers coming in. 8s, 9s, 8s. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yep, I see some more coming in here. Great. Yeah, you all are quite committed to your work. And as just to kind of like loop back around to something we said before, like the more of ourselves we put into our work, the more likely we're going to experience vicarious trauma. But the numbers that you're putting here are not showing, and this is not an end all be all question, but that's not showing evidence of disruption to your sense of meaning, right? Because your sense of meaning for work is quite high. Let me ask another question. To what extent do you believe that your spiritual practice, whatever that may be, your spiritual religious practice is worthwhile and meaningful in your life? Once again, on a 1 to 10 scale, how do people feel about that? How worthwhile is your spiritual practice in your life? And meaningful to you, I guess, is the ultimate question. Yeah, 9s, 8s, 9s. Yeah, nobody lower than an 8 or a 9 on any of this. I'm looking at some folks that believe that their spiritual practice is even higher than their work practice, or vice versa, right? And so that's interesting to think about, like what fills you up, what gives you a sense of meaning. One more question. Um, to what extent do you feel your social time that you spend with friends, is meaningful and worthwhile in your life on a 1 to 10 scale? Social time. Seeing an 8 there. Ooh, a lot more 9s showing up. Whereas on the previous questions, there were maybe a couple more 8s. I'm seeing a lot more 9s showing up. So it sounds like people's social lives are the thing that bring quite a bit of meaning as compared to other components of their lives, that's quite interesting. I kind of, I don't know if I like that or dislike that. I feel value neutral about it. Just interesting to see. Okay, so let's break this down a little bit. Let's talk about a sense of meaning and the way that it can be disrupted. Um, there are really three elements to having a sense of meaning, right? It's having a purpose, um, having goals and a direction in life, or having goals and a direction in an area of your life, right? What does the social do in your life? Well, the sense of purpose that it has, that is, it gets you away from your family, maybe, or it gets you talking about interesting topics, or it gets you out of the house more, right? It has some purpose. It also has some significance, right? The degree to which you believe that this component of your life has value, worth, and importance, and you all indicated kind of a high sense of significance of these areas that we talked about so far. Alan is mentioning solitude also plays a role in a sense of meaning. Yeah, it's not always just about being with people, but it's also about like your sense of, maybe that goes back to the last slide, Alan, right? Like your connection to yourself and how that contributes to your sense of meaning. And is your solo time meaningful and intentional? Or if you're like me sometimes when I'm not careful, do you just like doom scroll on your phone when you're alone, right? Every time I'm alone and I don't have to interact with anybody, immediately my hand goes to my phone, right? And so, yeah, like how intentional you can be with that solitude plays a pretty big role. And then finally, the kind of third element of a sense of meaning is having a sense of coherence, right? The sense that your life is characterized by predictability and routine. And so when our lives feel more chaotic, it's hard to feel a settled sense of meaning. I can give an example just from my life in the last couple of weeks. I've had a very full calendar in an unpredictable way. I sometimes do, and Kala and I have talked about the ways that we both do kind of this on-call work, right? And so when I get called in to do some of this other work, I don't know, right? Like I can't plan my life around it until maybe a day before. And that contributes to a sense of chaos in my life, that a loss of coherence. And it's harder for me to feel meaningful about that work that I'm doing because I can't predict it. There's no routine to it. It just is sort of happening to me. I don't feel like I have much control over it, right? So that decreases my sense of meaning there. Our lives really can be experienced as meaningful when we feel that there's a significance beyond just the trivialness and the momentary components of it, right? Yeah. And so what's the point of this? When folks have a high sense of meaning, in their lives overall, not just in one aspect of their life, but if you could say, like, I have a lot of a higher sense of meaning in my life, folks have lower risk of divorce, lower risk of living alone, increased connections with friends, and engagement in like social and cultural activities. Folks tend to have lower incidence of new chronic diseases and lower incidences of depression, lower obesity and increased physical activity, and increased adoption of positive health behaviors. There's all these like significant effects that are shown in the literature around having a high sense of meaning, right? And so thinking about the inverse of that, when vicarious trauma is disrupting our sense of meaning, all of those things become risk factors, right? And things that are not supporting our best health and our best wellness. Okay, I think I'm ready to kick it back over to you, Kalo. I think this is we're starting to dig into kind of specific symptoms or like effects and how that looks in our lives.
Yeah. So we've talked about vicarious trauma symptoms mirroring traditional trauma symptoms, right? And there being some overlap. So this could look like the bullets that we see here on the slide. No time or energy for one's self, right? Not engaging in the things that you used to really like to do, or not having any hobbies other than going to work and coming home and doing maybe the bare minimum things you need to do to survive. Feeling disconnected from your loved ones because all of your time and energies may be spent or exhausted, or all your empathy is just gone and limited because of the work that you do, which might also cause us to withdraw socially. Increased sensitivity to violence, or maybe even like poverty, or just things that you see in the workplace. Right. And I think increased sensitivity could like increased fear, increased sadness, increased hypervigilance. I think all of those things could be said about this. Generalized despair and hopelessness. Are we just overall really overwhelmed and not feeling great about the state of the world, maybe specifically our own world and what we can do with our own lives? And then a sense of hope and sense of safety in the world might also change in a way that is skewed more negative, right? If I no longer feel safe, or if I don't think my family is safe, or that nothing can get better, and I'm less hopeful, these might all be examples of what it looks like to be experiencing vicarious trauma in our own lives. This is a list that I think is very vicarious trauma specific, but I also want to share that like really any trauma symptom can go here, right? Because we are calling this a trauma. So things like nightmares, numbness, flashbacks, and things like that could also be considered, could also be like effects of your work and the work that you do. We're going to go through a couple of slides that dive into these things a little more specifically. So this slide says stop, and everything is written that way. If we stop doing these things, this could be a marker of vicarious trauma in our lives. So if we stop watching or reading the news, that might be a sign that we need some time and space. I also know many folks who do this intentionally, right? Or if you ever heard anybody like take a social media break, but also obsessively reading the news, maybe that comes out of fear. I'm afraid of what's going to happen, so I have to be consistently up to date with what's going on in my community or what's going on in the world around me. Same thing for if we maybe used to exercise really regularly and then we stop, right? Maybe that's a sign of vicarious trauma, and then the opposite as well. If we are over exercising, right? Just behaviors that are strange or different, but could be a result. And again, this example, I think it's important to name that we're talking about maybe on the extreme end of things, right? Because I think that there is a reality in which folks might exercise intentionally to like be processing and exerting some energy after what they experience in their workplace and just like general stress. And also like rest days are a thing. Some people need to rest, right? So those are not the examples that we're talking about. We're talking about if you are a regularly scheduled gym person and you just cannot do it anymore, that might be a sign. And then the same can be true if you are not, but you are just excessively exercising. Now that might be an example of vicarious trauma. If you stop going out with friends or socializing in ways that you used to, this could also be a sign of vicarious trauma. If you avoid television shows and TVs that depict violence, or feel increasingly stressed by displays of fictitious violence when you do see them, this is what we mean by hypersensitivity, right? Or hypervigilance around like these things. I'm feeling increasingly sensitive to these things after what I've experienced or I've navigated in my workplace. If you neglect other hobbies or things you do to care for yourself, could be a sign of vicarious trauma, or could represent that overall, that generalized despair that we've talked about. And of course, if you're not sleeping the way you used to, right, it could be another symptom or a sign of vicarious trauma. I think that we're ready for the next slide, right? So we had a lot of, if you stop this thing, maybe that's a sign of vicarious trauma. And here we are, here, if you pick up these things, if you start doing these things, after maybe feeling really impacted by some work stress, these might be symptoms of vicarious trauma. So if you drink alcohol when you're feeling overwhelmed, as a way to cope, could be a sign that we maybe need some other coping strategies to use if the reason we're drinking is because of what we're experiencing in the workplace. If we start wondering how we can carry on with our day-to-day life when clients have been completely disrupted by trauma, that I think plays into that deservability piece we were talking about. Do I deserve the life that I have given this really hard circumstance this person that I really care about at work is experiencing? If you've ever considered a different or more detached career path, right, where you maybe don't have to care about people as much and can like punch numbers or sit at a desk and not engage with folks. I think this happens a lot. You might know people in your own life who have done a career change after just feeling really worn out and tired of the work that they're doing, specifically in the helping field. If we start to do things like watch more TV, or we're engaging in activities where we just have to sit there and we find us sitting there for, or find ourselves sitting for hours and hours and hours, right? That might be a sign that we are struggling with some other things. This could be a symptom of something. I think also this one really resembles that idea of dissociation or that idea of disconnection. If we're having more dreams and nightmares, or feeling we can't shut off our brain, if anybody's familiar with the idea of rumination, right? This might be a sign that work is occupying so much of our brain space. And this is also what it looks like to experience like a traditional trauma symptom as a result of something you maybe haven't experienced yourself, right? These aren't nightmares because something bad happened to you at work. These are going to be nightmares because of the stress you experience at work and what you're exposed to, given your client interactions. Substance use, we kind of named alcohol already, but if you're engaging in any substances to cope, I think that could also be a sign of this. We've done harm reduction trainings with this crew before, but one of the things I like to tell the clients that I work with on my own, who are navigating like their own relationships with substances, is like when you do pick up or you are using, I think a good compass we might be able to use is, like, am I doing this because it feels good, it's pleasurable, it's entertaining, or am I running away from something? Am I trying to escape something? One of those we might have a little more control over than the other. And if we are using substances to do things like just be at work or to stay awake and feel good about ourselves, that might be a sign of some unhealthy coping we've got going on, as a result of our workplace or the things that we experience at our workplace. And then also any thoughts of like suicide or self-harm that might be directly related to work. I think, again, about that deservability piece. Do I deserve the things that I have, or am I in complete despair after bearing witness to the things that my clients and participants are holding and navigating on a day-to-day basis? Alrighty, we're going to move on to the feelings piece. If we feel these things, they might be signs or symptoms that we are experiencing some vicarious trauma in the workplace. If we are excessively worried, and maybe we weren't really a huge worrier before, this could be a sign of vicarious trauma. So, and these might be things that you maybe haven't been concerned with before. And you see those examples in parentheses there, like a plane crash or violence happening to you. If you've ever been in a car accident and then have been like a little more jumpy, right, afterward, or when you do start driving again, this vicarious trauma, I think, was this client that I know at work, or this colleague or coworker I know at work. I'm feeling these ways. That generalized sense of despair is here as well. So sadness, or we're feeling depressed or out of sorts. If we're unable to feel anything or like a robot, if we're on autopilot or feeling numb, I think that also represents dissociation or that disconnectedness that we talked about a good deal already. And the same with feeling numb or mindlessly kind of tuning out through like doom scrolling or playing video games for hours at a time. When you look at the clock and you're like, okay, I can do this for 20 minutes, and then 3 hours go by, right? It's like, whoa, where did that time go? What am I doing? How did I get here? If we feel distant from or angry at your loved ones, especially feeling like you can't understand what's going on, this could also be a sign of vicarious trauma. If we're afraid of things happening to the people that we love. We had a case example last week that looked like that, of like an attorney who worked with like children or like families that had children, right? And she had like an increased sense of or a loss of a sense of safety for her children or family, became hypervigilant. If you don't remember that, that's okay. But that is a sign of vicarious trauma. I'm experiencing this thing at work. I'm exposed to this thing at work, and it's leaking into my personal life, is what that could look like or sound like. Anxiety might also be a symptom. That is a trauma symptom generally. And then increased irritability, right? If we're uncharacteristically impatient with our colleagues and friends, these are all feelings that can come with the vicarious trauma space or experiencing vicarious trauma in our workplace. So these are, I think this is a nice list of what it looks like to like stop things as a result of like this increased empathy we're engaging in our workplace that is necessary for us to be doing our jobs. If we start things that we maybe haven't done before that feel really funky, and then the funky feelings as well, all signs that we could be experiencing something like vicarious trauma in our lives.
I wonder, I put this in the chat and one person did respond, but I wonder if on the start, stop, and feel, whether anything is standing out, any one thing in particular is standing out to folks out there as impactful, or you're saying to yourself, maybe I need to check in with this. Like this has been happening maybe a little too much for comfort. Is there anything that stands out on the start, stop, and feel list for you? Which things hit close to home? I'll say for me, I tend to be very diligent and disciplined with my like routines and activities and my self-care. And when that gets when that gets disrupted is a pretty big indicator for me. Like if I just can't make it to the gym, or um, I'm not doing my routines as typical, by like week 2 of that, I really have to check in with that, because it's a pretty big indicator for me. I'm not seeing anything pop up in the chat right now, so I guess I'll keep us moving. Oh, there we go. There's Samantha. Yep, feeling numb. Stop going to the gym. Yeah. So that sense of dissociation, that loss of routine. Yep, very similar for me, Samantha. Thanks for sharing that. All righty. I think for the first time in a significant way in this training series, we're going to talk a little bit about the impact that all of this has on our clients, right? So when Samantha is feeling numb and stops going to the gym, and I see Lauren responding now. Looks like Lauren moved to like a new, easier career path, and feeling detached in many ways, right? So when those things start to pop up, not only does it affect us, right? And we need to care about us. We've only got so much time on this earth, and we want to make the most of it that we can. And it doesn't feel good to feel numb and to not do the routines that we have. Or if I'm going to the gym, if I'm questioning whether that even has any purpose in my life, like what's the value of it? I'm just doing it to do it, right? Like that sense of meaning is gone. I see Alan responding that when I'm so busy with schedules and not having the time with myself. And yeah, Alan, I saw you had mentioned the importance of solitude in your life earlier, right? And so when you stop being able to take that time for yourself is when you notice it. Yeah. So, but all of this, the less time you have for yourself, the more detached Lauren feels, the less Samantha's going to the gym, and the more they're feeling numb, the bigger the impact on our clients, right? And that's a part that we don't always think about. But like when we're funky, we show up and do the work in a funky way, right? So we talked earlier last session about the way that stress kind of exists on the same spectrum of experience as trauma, right? The more acute or the more long term our stress is, the more it might shift into a space of a type of trauma for us, a direct trauma. And that our stress as helpers kind of parallels our client's stress, right? And so that may manifest for us as burnout, as secondary trauma, and ultimately as vicarious trauma. And one of the ways that all of that affects clients is through this process of countertransference, right? And countertransference is a very clinical term, of course, but we just want to kind of quickly define that. Basically, what it means is any feeling we have toward our client, right? It's our feelings towards our clients are not always about our clients, right? We're often projecting things onto our clients, things from how we were raised, or people that we knew, or people that we currently know, or whatever else I'm dealing with on the outside of my work life. That's going to show up sometimes as projection onto our clients, right? And those things can be positive. We can feel positive. Our countertransference can be positive towards our clients, or it can be negative. And the key is that we need to be aware of it, right? We need to be taking note of that countertransference and developing some self-awareness, so that we can make more supportive choices in that helping relationship. But when we're feeling burnt out, when we are experiencing more acute effects of secondary trauma, and then when we're experiencing kind of the long-term disconnection from ourselves and others and our sense of meaning, that's going to show up as a countertransference experience with the client, right? When it's unexamined, it's unmanaged, it's going to have the potential to damage the relationship with the client, right? I have heard it said that you don't need to like your client in order to help them. And I think there's something to that. But I also know, and we've talked about in this training series so much, that the interpersonal relationship, the therapeutic alliance, is maybe one of the single most important factors in supporting people, right? And so if your countertransference, your feelings that you're having towards your client as a result of your own burnout, secondary trauma, and vicarious trauma, um, are having an effect on the therapeutic alliance, it's gonna translate into greater client stress, but also just worse outcomes, right? People are not gonna do as well because of the intense value of therapeutic alliance work in this helping profession. That's not showing. If you're not showing up in that relationship well, you're gonna see worse outcomes, right? And potentially you're gonna do harm there as well, right? So we talked about the therapeutic alliance kind of in depth earlier in this series. And we're going to give it back to you again through this lens of vicarious trauma. I'll kick it over to you, Kalo.
Awesome. So we did talk about the therapeutic alliance specifically through the harm reduction lens. I want to remind folks that when we say this, we're talking about the quality of interpersonal relationships between you and the folks that you're serving. And when we don't address our own needs, we are negatively impacting the therapeutic alliance. And I think that we say that as like a kind of like encouragement, right? Some people have a really hard time caring about themselves, especially folks in the helping profession sometimes, right? So I don't mean like just in like the depressive symptom way, but in like I am just like a selfless person. I want to save the world, that sort of thing, right? I'll give everything I have, which there are some issues there with like a savior complex and all of that stuff too. But what I like to encourage folks to do or to think about, if you do find yourself maybe falling into that camp of like, I will literally give the shirt off my back, is to think about what happens when the next client comes to you and also needs a shirt, right? You have less to give. So the gentle challenge here is to think about it in a way that looks like or sounds like taking care of yourself is taking care of your clients and your participants. I might have given an example in the first session around, I was really upset after a therapy session one time, and I told my clinical supervisor, I'm not going to go to trivia tonight. And my supervisor told me, Khalil, your client needs you to go to trivia tonight. And I said, okay, I'm going to go to trivia tonight, right? What he was telling me in that moment was that I needed to do something for myself. And maybe it wasn't trivia. In that moment, it was, right? But you do need to sustain and maintain like your own sense of empathy and feel good feelings and sense of hope for the people that you work with. There does need to be care and attention pointed inward, right, toward you. And as cliche as it sounds, it is that idea of like putting your own like oxygen mask on first, or just really prioritizing yourself, but for good reason, right? And that does benefit other people. Um, I had a client once that said something that sounded so beautiful, and he said the best thing he can do for his son is be a good husband to his wife, and I was like, wow, how iconic that statement, right? But I think about that too, is like maybe the best thing we can do for our participants is be taking care of ourselves. So when we start to lack these things that you see on the screen, right, which do make up the therapeutic alliance, those might be some signals that I need to tune in, or I need to take a bath, or whatever that looks like for you, right? When our work is no longer collaborative or purposeful, our participants are going to feel that, right? Especially through a harm reduction lens and in the homelessness and substance use settings. Our work needs to be collaborative if folks are going to benefit and move toward health and wellness. And things like respect and genuine affection, of course, we want to be able to engage in those things in our relationships with our participants, right? If these things start to dwindle or are lacking, those might also be signals that, hey, I need some attention. And maybe that attention needs to be from me or like my own social supports. Yeah, we really want to do our best to maintain the therapeutic alliance to also and keep moving our clients toward the goals that they do want to be moving toward. One of the stats that we shared maybe in the last session is that the relationship piece accounts for 50% of positive client outcomes. So it is just as important as choosing the correct like clinical intervention or like medication intervention, right? Your match, your relationship is just as important as the intervention being delivered. So a pretty crucial part. That's what I've got, right?
Awesome. Yeah, thanks. And I'll just note that I'm just struck by the fact that like the bubbles that you see on the screen, that components of therapeutic alliance, respect, genuine affection, collaboration, trust, these things are like directly attacked by vicarious trauma, right? The disruptions to sense of self and others and sense of meaning are like exactly the things that are going to interrupt your ability to build trustful and respectful and affectionate relationships and engage in collaboration with other people, right? And so it's a one-to-one kind of effect there. Oh, here we go. Talking a little bit more about some of those negative effects on clients.
So we really want to make sure that we are, if you think back to the trauma-informed care training, we really want to do our best to resist re-traumatization, right? We don't want to be the reason folks are harmed additionally. They're coming to us with a lot of hurt. They're coming to us with a lot of harm, maybe have already been traumatized in their life. So when we're not able to maintain empathy for folks or engage in connection, that does have negative effects on a client who is already coming to us with maybe a pretty extensive trauma history. What that could look like is these negative effects in just like healing, I think in general, right? Recovery in general, which could look like, wow, my therapist or my case manager or my service coordinator, whoever, they don't respond to me very kindly, right? What does that mean about me? Participants internalize the things that we say and how we treat them. So that is really important to keep in mind. And then sometimes our own behaviors, maybe as a result of vicarious trauma or burnout, could actually be the spark or be the match that starts a fire, right? That increases the likelihood of our participants acting out or backtracking or moving away from like a healthier outcome. An example I like to give is one time I saw a clinical director roll their eyes at a participant, right? And that participant immediately picked up on that, immediately was loud and upset, understandably so, right? But could have definitely been something that was avoided in that moment. And I'm not shaming that clinical director, right? I think that what that person was experiencing is a sign of something like vicarious trauma, right? I just can't deal with this right now, is what was being displayed to the participant. And that was very felt, right? So if we're rolling our eyes at our participants, what does that do to the things that you see on the left here on the screen, right? What does that do? Or what does that tell a client about how they are perceived or how we perceive them? Let's say about their self-image. What are they going to interpret from those interactions? And does that cause them to do things like act out, or maybe even avoid you or avoid engaging in care moving forward? Anything to add here, Ryan?
Yeah, I was thinking about your like eye rolling example, and this like last point that I wanted to make in our notes here is that like these things are gonna happen, right? And like that's pretty typical of like the ups and downs of a relationship where maybe I don't show up as my best self today, or I end up rolling my eyes, right? I think that is okay that that happens occasionally. I guess I'm not saying that it's okay that we roll our eyes at clients, but there are going to be times when our empathy feels less accessible, and where we see things like acting out or regression or folks end treatment. Um, and so it's okay that that happens occasionally, but that should be a signal that we do some more work, right? Those things that shouldn't be the norm, right? Those shouldn't be kind of happening regularly. And if you're seeing all of that and not looking inward, it's very possible to kind of blame all of that on the client, right? Well, they're just like acting up again. They don't seem to want recovery enough, or they're not ready. And that may be true, but another likelihood is that we're not showing up in that therapeutic alliance correctly. And so our empathy is not accessible, and we're seeing those worse outcomes, right? So always looking inward first, I think, is our big message here around some of these things that are going to happen, that are going to show up.
Alrighty, tapping into deep roots. I think what I want to say here is that we can't give up before we've tried, right? So clients are going to come to us pissed off, heated, mad, upset, angry, holding all the things that they do, which comes with things like street homelessness, substance use, and addiction, right? And one of the things we really want to encourage folks to think about is that the participants and the folks that we serve likely already have a history of mistrust towards providers, in their care settings, right? So, what somebody's bringing to the table or like how they're presenting might have nothing to do with me, right? But here I am the social worker. And I think a lot of times in the helping profession, participants might think you are the cop or the person that can completely fix and resolve every issue, or a big issue, right? And ideally, we probably could be we would like to be the resolver and the fixer. Um, all this to say, it is a career in the helping profession can be tricky, and we know that some of our the history of some of our organizations, or just like care, healthcare, medical care in general, have been harmful to folks that maybe need our services the most, or are represented disproportionately or at higher rates in our agencies. So cycles of mistrust for people in otherwise marginalized groups. So this is our Black and brown folks, our queer folks, our folks with different abilities. Um, we might have a responsibility to be mindful and protective of um, the therapeutic alliance and the trust that's being built there, right? What's it look like to just let somebody rant and rave about the really awful experience they had at the appointment they were at before they make their way to me, right? This is their experience, and we don't want to invalidate that for them. We say this to kind of normalize what somebody might be coming with, right? We know folks are coming to us with trauma histories often, but we don't want to increase somebody's distrust or give them a reason to mistrust us in the care that we are going to provide. So we want to hold that really delicately. We know that historically, medical and health institutions have not been in favor of Black and Brown communities or queer folks. We also know that law, psychology, and science have been skewed and used to justify non-equitable treatment for folks, or really harmful, dangerous, and damaging treatment or experiments on bodies of folks who are already historically have been harmed in big ways. Worker turnover is going to be another, I think, I want to also call this like a workplace hazard as well, like we call like empathy or the idea of like experiencing vicarious trauma, but we know at our agencies and institutions it's hard to keep folks. And maybe that is because of or a direct result of things like vicarious trauma, or the harm that helping professionals might experience in the field. But we know that when staff is consistently changing, that decreases the quality of care we're able to provide. There is communication that is dropped. There are cases that are dropped or people that might be forgotten about in the midst of that, because that decreases the consistency we're able to show up with for folks that we serve, which understandably makes folks feel unstable or insecure. Maybe you in your own workplace and like, ugh, what am I going to have to pick up next, right? But then also our participants feeling quite similarly. If you've ever heard Ryan and I do a crisis training or a crisis intervention training, we talk about just stability being really important, right? People need to know, the folks that you serve need to know that you are solid and confident in your work role. But how can you be if turnover is just so super high, right? You don't know what's going to come next, or you don't know what how your role might shift or change if people keep cycling in and out of your agencies. So we know that this has a negative impact on clients as well, and can be one of the reasons that clients do mistrust the system. I think oftentimes we engage with folks and just expect them to trust us right away because we are who we are and they need something from us, right? But that really invalidates the idea that our participant might have already had some really harmful interactions prior to engaging with us or our agency. And a high work turnover also discourages workers from remaining in or even entering the field. I know I've had work experiences where like people leave in groups sometimes, right? I'm quitting, you're quitting, we're all quitting at the same time, right? It can just be a really discouraging experience overall.
Yeah. We're drawing quite near to the end of this session, and we wanted to wrap up with a bit of an experiential moment with you. So I'm going to drop a link to the chat. I'm going to just want to cue folks if you're kind of tuning in to other things, or if you got a second screen up or working on emails or something like that. I just want to invite folks to kind of tune back in with us. I've dropped a link to the chat in the chat, and it brings us to a Canva page. And that Canva page is full of sticky notes, right? And this activity is called the silent witness activity. And so what I'm going to ask is that folks open that link and choose a sticky note to maybe just write in an anonymous way. Nobody else can see what you're writing. Any of the built up ways that you've experienced vicarious traumatization over your career as a helper. Again, this is anonymous. The purpose of this is to kind of share in a safe way, maybe ways that we feel messed up by some of the experiences that we have had or through our longer careers, and ways that maybe we have not intentionally done harm to the folks that we've served, right? So I'd love folks to kind of share, click on one of those sticky notes where it says add text, and just share what feels right to share about your experience of vicarious trauma. Again, the purpose is for us to sit with this in silence and just bear witness to our
Mhm.
colleagues who are also experiencing this occupational hazard. So I'm going to give us about 10 minutes of silent time, maybe less, and just inviting you to share your experience.
If you click the link in Canva's like sign in, you can just click the X. You don't have to sign in.
It looks like some folks already have Canva accounts. So I just want to kind of shout out that I am seeing some like names pop up on there. And if that feels uncomfortable for you, I'll just invite you to like pause what you're doing, click log out, and then re-click that link. And if not, that's okay too. You're more than welcome to kind of write non-anonymously. I'll just leave this up for 2 more minutes. If you have already typed something or if you're still thinking, just inviting folks to bear witness to your colleagues' stories and just share space. We're not going to respond directly to these, but we want to sit with them and be intentional about that space. All right, folks. I just want to say thanks so much for sharing what you shared and sitting with that space in that mindful way, bearing witness with your colleagues, recognizing in ways that maybe you're not always recognized, how hard this work is and the effect that it can have on us. Okay, I'm going to take us through some wrap up. Couple key takeaways here. We know that empathy plays a really important part in being an effective helper, but we know that it has a significant effect on us that is going to build up over time. When we're able to put our oxygen mask on first, when we're able to address our own needs, that's going to enable us to continue engaging in healthy ways with our participants in ways that are going to enrich the therapeutic alliance and ultimately are going to see better outcomes. We talked about pretty intensively today the way that the shift in the worldview and the disruptions to our sense of self and our connections to others and our life meaning may be signs that you're experiencing vicarious trauma. That's not meant to be pathologizing. It's something that we're probably all going to experience at some point, but it is a clue. It's an indicator to us to take a closer look at what's going on in order to best support ourselves and our clients. All right, let me share with you some next steps here. Actually, let me pause there real quick. Are there any questions that are coming up for folks? Questions or comments? Things that you want to last minute share or ask us? We do have a few minutes, so I want to make space for that. If not, that's okay, but I'll just be quiet for a second and see if there's any questions that folks have. Thanks, Samantha. I appreciate your kind words. Thanks for adding your thoughts and contributions too. Okay, so I'll just invite folks to complete the session evaluation. Dropped a link to that in the chat just now. We would love your feedback on the session, positive, critical, whatever it is. We can benefit a great deal from all of that feedback. If you do complete that session evaluation, you'll get a certificate of attendance automatically emailed to you within the next 2 hours or so. And I have one more next step for you. I want to invite you to take stock once again, and it may be a more intentional way when you've got some solitude outside of this training. Take stock of some of the ways that you might be stopping or starting or feeling things in response to your work. How might this be impacting your trust relationships with your client? Right? So take a few minutes, quiet, in solitude, in an intentional and mindful way to kind of hash out some of this stuff. We'll talk strategies next time quite a bit, but I think part of the process is understanding the effect this is having on us. So I'll invite you to do that over the course of the next week. And so that's it for today. That's it for us. Thank you so much, folks, for being here with us and sharing this space with us. We're going to wrap up this 3-part series next week. That's Wednesday, same time, 12 p.m. And again, we'll be more focused on ways that we can manage our vicarious trauma. So looking forward to seeing you then, and I hope you have a great week. Thanks, folks.
See you all.